So welcome everyone to our inaugural Brown Bag discussion series. My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon. I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. And before we begin today's conversation, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And wherever possible, I think it's important, at least for me, to kind of try and personalize this. So with that, I grew up in on Treaty 61, which is known as the Robinson-Huron Treaty, and that's in Northern Ontario. It's home of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi peoples, and sits across from the unceded island of territory of Manitoulin Island. My family is now settled in Saskatchewan on Treaty 6 territory, and that's home of the Cree, the Dene, the Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota, Sioux, Innu, and Métis. I'm forever grateful to the land, the water, and the skies of both where I grew up and this prairie community. They've taught me the beauty of these places, or all our places, and the peoples that form the communities that reside there. And just before we conclude, I'd like to ask that we all be good neighbors to one another, good stewards of this land, and good ancestors to our children. So a little bit about this conversation, this brown bag conversation today that we're starting off today. This conversation series emerged as the result of a suggestion from one of the people on our advisory committee. We have a committee of co-op and credit union people who help steer our ship, make sure we're not shifting too far off course. And they kind of lamented the fact that there are so few opportunities for people, particularly today, who work in the cooperative and credit union sector to get together and have kind of informal chats, just the kinds of things that used to happen at events. Those don't happen so much anymore. So we thought, well, here's a way, this brown bag series is a way for that to happen. But also to allow for some cross-fertilization between cooperatives and credit unions. So not that they're in their silos like they have been, but that they can kind of start chatting amongst themselves. And as we all know, these kind of informal relationships are the tissues that stitch together humans, our communities. They're vitally important for a sense of well-being, and by extension, I think, the potential for cooperatives and credit unions. And they can also be, I think, gateways to innovation, to those times where we bounce ideas off each other and then magic kind of happens. And that, in a sense, is the subject of today's inaugural Brown Bag Lunch, those opportunities for that magic to happen. But before I introduce our speakers, and I will do that in a minute, I'm going to ask Jen, my colleague here, to say a few words about herself, and then I'll introduce Eric and Mary, our speakers. Jen, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Marc-Andre. So I work with Marc-Andre at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. I've been a professional research associate here for the last 2.5 years. And a lot of what I do is I teach governance workshops, sometimes in collaboration with Johnson Chayama's Exec Ed program, and sometimes with our partner, Cooperatives First, which is a nonprofit organization here in Saskatchewan. And through this process, I've come to really value this conversations with people working in the sector across the country. I was born here in Treaty 6 territory, but I moved at a very young age, and I continued to move for the rest of my life, about once every 2 years. And I think that experience as well has also brought me to appreciate the idea of making connections between people from different places, from different fields, from different backgrounds. And I share Marc-Andre's enthusiasm for this Brown Bag initiative. And I'm hopeful that the conversations that we have over these monthly sessions are going to make a lot of new connections for all of us. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jen. So now I'm going to introduce our speakers. First up, Eric Dillon is the Chief Executive Officer of Conexus Credit Union and has been since 2011. Prior to joining Conexus, Eric worked at Service Credit Union, where I like to say you rubbed shoulders with the giant of credit union land, Ian Glassford, a fellow mentor. I don't know, I consider him a mentor of mine in terms of innovative thinking about credit unions and cooperatives. On his LinkedIn page, people describe Eric as a visionary leader, servant leader, who brings a lot of energy to whatever he does. And based on my experience, I don't going on 10, 12 years now, Eric, I think that's really true. It sounds about right to me. So with that, welcome, Eric. Now I'd like to introduce Mary. Mary Weimer is Conexus's Chief Member Experience Officer. Mary was born and raised in Regina, and she's a University of Regina graduate. We just learnher grandfather was the chancellor for many years. Mary and her husband, Jeremy, have owned the Assiniboia Gallery since 1999. And in 2013, she took leave from the day-to-day operations of the gallery to join Hilberg and Burke as its chief operating officer. And then she's been with Conexus as their chief member experience officer since 2018. She also coins new phrases. What is it? Bankery, I think, is the term you use to describe bank talk. So that's her side gig. Mary, thank you so much. And Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass it over to you to lead us in a short talk. Then Jen and I will have a conversation, and then we're going to do breakouts. That's where people get to connect with each other. So over to you, Eric and Mary.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having us. The idea of the brown bag, Marc-Andre happened to be down in southern Saskatchewan just a couple weeks ago and floated this idea. And I think it's really cool what you're trying to accomplish in terms of bringing cooperators across the province together. And of course, it dawned on me that it's not that far off Co-op Week when we were all together celebrating merit awards and those things. And clearly, we should do more of that. Mary and I are joining from Treaty 4 territory here in southern Saskatchewan, so we're really thrilled to be here. And we get asked a lot about this idea. They hear either about the incubator or the venture fund, and it's most of the time it's about like what is this thing and how does it work? And so I think what we'd like to do today is just a few slides about a bit of the history about why we're doing what we're doing, a bit of like what is this funky thing, and Mary leads this work at Conexus, and then a bit about the venture fund, which again is a separate and unique animal. And then we've got some kind of early metrics about what we've been able to create in our community in terms of outcomes and really growing local enterprises in a more, what we would say is kind of the local sustainable economy. So, and as you all know, Conexus has been around for a long time, and we have a really rich history of giving back to community. And this is just a slide taken from our most recent annual report. $3 million is about, generally speaking, on average, the causes that we find in community. But what's really cool, I think, recently is we found more creative ways to give back to Saskatchewan. Some might have heard of something in the middle of the COVID pandemic. We rolled out what was called the Conexus Kindness Capital Fund. And it was a fund just to recognize these extraordinary acts of serving community in the really dark days or early days of COVID that I think were remarkable. And Cultivator is a byproduct, I think, of this idea of that credit unions really have this special role about being a catalyst for thinking differently in community. And in our case, pooling capital and ideas and people together to generate economic growth and opportunity in Saskatchewan. So if you don't know, I know you know cooperatives, but if you don't know Conexus, we manage about, say, just easy math, $10 billion on behalf of 150,000 members across the province. What, if you're not in the credit union system, you might not know is credit unions have about a 50% market share in the small business market in Saskatchewan. So we've always had a very rich history of serving small business in Saskatchewan. This is a picture of a building, and you might think, what's that got to do with an incubator? Part of the genesis of our kind of, I would say, recast effort around supporting small business was around creating this center. University of Regina looking for a partner on lands where the original College West building is here in Regina. And of course, lots of people heard about the project itself, but what they don't know about the project in terms of partnering with them had to really identify 4 areas that we would help serve as part of the building project. One of those was around local economic development. And so we'd always had this idea of, is it possible to actually build a credit union run incubator to really support the growth of small local Saskatchewan businesses and grow them into what we believe can be globally competitive businesses. So the idea for the incubator was really born out of our original thinking about what a building could deliver for a community if a credit union was at the center of this building. There were other things, obviously commitment to arts and culture, the connection to Dark Hall, and those things are important. But for the purposes of today, it was really about this promise to reimagine what a credit union's role is in terms of serving community. So first, I think what Mary and I'd like to do is talk a bit about like this thing called Cultivator, and Mary runs this thing. So she's way better to speak to it than I am. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit about the venture fund.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So we have a wonderful team of Conexus employees that work in the cultivator space. Our manager is Jordan McFarland, and we're actually going to be celebrating our 3rd birthday coming up in January. And the research and the thinking for creating a business incubator started a few years in advance of when we actually began. And in researching, the environments around the world, really, Eric and some colleagues traveled all over the world to see other ecosystems that had been successful doing this. And one of the things that they discovered is that really successful tech ecosystems are often connected to small cities, and particularly in rural areas around areas that are high for agriculture. So that sort of definitely opportunities for Conexus being in Saskatchewan. Cultivator provides a few key things for the founders and the businesses that work from that space. So in no particular order, because I would say community is probably the number one. So particularly in the early days, community meant in person, absolutely 100%. It's been really interesting over COVID to adapt to more virtual, and the benefits of that in that we can connect with people literally all over the world. Of course, the space that Eric talked about in our new HQ on College Avenue in Regina allows a space for founders and teams to work and collaborate, the mentorship and the coaching, the programming and events, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Services, so things like marketing in residence, legal in residence, accounting in residence, where our founders, as part of being accepted into the program, can get some free advice that's really, really important, especially at the early stages. And then finally, access to capital. So whether it's helping with getting investor ready, pitches, practicing, feedback, and then also just a pipeline to those investors. So programs, this is a bit of a visual of how the programs feed into each other. So the very first thing that we actually did at Cultivator was this event called the 24-hour startup. And since then we've done it many times over. And it's just like it says, it's 24 hours, bunch of people who have ideas with different skill sets get together. And within 24 hours at the end, they pitch minimum viable product, and then we award prizes. It's a great way to feed into what our next program is, which is called START. This is the early stage, runs in the evenings and on weekends. These are people with ideas, and they just need a place to come over 3 months, and just they go through a really elaborate curriculum, and every week it's augmented with speakers and special guests, and they follow the plan to sort of test and validate their idea. And that is something that happens twice a year. The next thing that usually happens after START is this idea of this grow cohort. So we'll be feeding into the grow cohort all the time as companies are ready. So at this point, founders are like fully involved, full-time, this is their job. They probably have some employees and they have a product in market. And but their revenue would be under $250,000 a year. And then the next, which is our most recent ad, and it's the smallest program of around 4 or 5 companies at any given time. This is scale. So these companies are now a really going concern. They have revenue over $250,000, and the support that we're providing them is very much one-to-one. As opposed to grow, which would be more of a one-to-many model. In scale, we're making sure those founders are lined up exactly with the specific people that they need. And then, of course, the final piece here is just the network that you build with, you could be an alumni, the connection to mentors. That's a really important part of Cultivator. On this next slide, this is an example of our START cohort that we just had in 2021. So we had one in the winter, one in the summer. Just to give you a quick example here, Store to Door, which is on the slide, they've got in the last quarter 30 employees. And so they went from start in the quarter one of 2021 to quarter three of 2021 into grow 30 employees, 85, $100 a month in revenue. Another company that's doing really well is BudSense from that group also has moved into grow. And then of these companies you see on this slide, half of them have female founders. So that's something else that we're really proud of, to provide a space that's welcoming to everybody.
So that's a bit about, so what does Cultivator do? It just basically takes these companies from idea through to globally competitive. A company Mary didn't talk about is a really cool company called Mycomply. So 2 Saskatchewan kids build this company, and I was at a pitch one day and they're talking about needing more capital. And I said, what do you need the capital for? And they're like, Eric, we're going to take Los Angeles. And I'm like, oh, okay. And of course, being, the finance person, I'm like, tell me more about that. And they said, well, you might not know, but every construction worker in New York City now building any project of any sort is required to use our software. And I said, really? Like, how many people is that? And they said, well, it's only about 310,000 users. And I said, oh, okay. Well, we should figure out how you're going to take LA then. So now if you want to build any project in the city of New York, this software that tracks the, attendance, safety certifications, on-site versus not on-site of any construction project in New York City, built from 2 kids in Saskatchewan. That's the kind of stuff. And you don't know about these companies, but they're globally competitive from here. The other problem that we saw in our early research was, of course, it's one thing to have great ideas and great founders. It's another about the access to capital. So back in 2018, as this slide would suggest, there was $3.7 billion in venture capital committed across the country. And you can see little itty bitty Saskatchewan had 8 out of 610 deals for 16 million, I think that says, of the 3.7 billion, which wasn't a very big number. So Saskatchewan was virtually a rounding error. So of all the money deployed into high growth companies, Saskatchewan virtually had 0. This is a problem. And of course, we're very lucky that we're a credit union. And of course, you all know this, but we're in the business of pooling local capital to support local growth. So we saw clearly a role from us, not just to use Conexus money, but to pool capital in our community to support these high growth companies so that a Mycomply could take New York and then Los Angeles, or a Store to Door could now do door-to-door retailing for micro merchants to compete with the Amazons of the world. So of course, we knew as part of our research that part of the solution was an associated venture fund, which we stood up our first fund about mid 2019. And you'd think, well, that's probably pardon my language, that's probably a pretty shitty time to stand up a venture fund right before a global health pandemic. But interestingly, in 2019, we went from $16 million in Saskatchewan to $114 million distributed in Saskatchewan. And only 11 deals, but on a percentage basis, it's about 4x what was committed in Saskatchewan the year before, or 400% growth in the amount of venture capital committed to Saskatchewan in our first 6 months of operation. So what that tells you is that there was quality founders, investment-ready companies, and they were being absolutely overlooked by the traditional venture centers in Canada, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. And clearly, we had hit on something interesting. And while we're a credit union, and Cultivator is run very much as a community investment approach, we spend about $1 million a year supporting those founders. And as Mary said, there's no cost to the accountant in residence, the lawyer in residence. We pay for that at Conexus, so it's about $1 million. But the venture fund, we absolutely expect to share in the great returns that the founders are earning. And so again, as I said earlier, we launched our $30 million venture fund in July. Typically, it takes a venture fund about 5-6 months to raise the money to stand up a traditional venture fund. It took us 41 days to go from 0 to fully funded. And in fact, we had to expand the cap on our fund to say the maximum was originally 30 million. We've now gone up to 33 million because we've had more people wanting to participate in pooling capital for Saskatchewan companies. And as we said, Cultivator is run as a community project. The venture fund is not. I don't know about your mutual fund investments, but right now our fund is about 30% internal rate of return. So it's very successful financially in investing in high growth Saskatchewan founders. And our hypothesis, which we sought and did the research around in 2016, 2017, was that we had great founders. We have 1 degree of separation in Saskatchewan. So if you want access to a business person who's done this, seen this, those connections are really easy to make. And we have people in Saskatchewan, very successful business people, who want nothing more than to give back. So a great story would be, we have a young company building parking software. Well, the Hill family is a very successful family that manages a lot of real estate. We literally picked up the phone, phoned Mo Bunden, who was the chief operating officer at Harvard Developments, and said, Mo, you love community, we love community. We have a company that's building parking software. We think they can add value to the Harvard group of companies. Would you have lunch with them? He said, how does 11:45 sound? Just tell me where to be. You can't do that in a Toronto or a Montreal or a Vancouver. And it's one of the benefits of like local community wrapping their arms around these founders. So our fund, again, has been super successful. And then I think Mary's going to share just how many, like what's been the throughput of Cultivator in our early days.
So metrics, one of the things we teach companies as they go through the programming is how important it is to track metrics so that you can really just continue to validate what you're doing is working. So these metrics, I'll just sort of draw your attention to the top line. So we're talking about all time. So from when we began in 2019 until the end of the second quarter this year, this is just a few of the things that we track. So 66 companies have been incubated formally in the Start and Grow programs. Over 560 investor connections. So that's meetings, pitches, that kind of thing. The public funding aspect, there is funding available through the provincial and the federal government. And it's really important for founders to know about that and have access. And then maybe one of the most exciting is this one around job creation, 245 jobs created. And just one of the things that we've noticed that has grown so much is the start. So that first entry, that start, you've got an idea. In 2021, we had 110 applications for the START program, and we've got about 20 to 24 spots for the entire year. So it just shows you, and we're finding that every cohort we do, the quality of these ideas is just unbelievable. So we'll go over to the next slide, which is talking a little bit about economic impact. So Conexus was kind of wondering, we put actual dollars into funding Cultivator. What is that generating? So we did some math and found that for every dollar that connects us to Cultivator, those companies turn that into $6, over $6 in revenue, over $9 in private capital raised, and almost 13 in public funding. The final thing I'll mention just on this slide is, so the metrics piece is really important, and the programming piece is really important. And another aspect that has grown and become part of what we do are the events. So you may start to have heard of some of these things that we did, the Canada's Farm Show, a 24-hour AgTech startup, the annual startup summit that we hold in September. So being successful at the programming level with the founders allows us to expand even further out so that we can reach more people. And then the next slide, just some good news headlines. BetaKit is an important publication for the tech ecosystem in Canada, and it's really exciting. We've gotten a lot of profile in BetaKit, which helps to turn, especially investors, eyes towards Saskatchewan and what's happening. And then some of these companies might be familiar to you. Eric mentioned Mycomply. Precision AI is an example of a scale company working out of Cultivator. They have received a multi-million-dollar funding privately and through public funding through PIC. So yeah, there's just a lot of exciting things happening, and we're talking about real sizable investments and the creation of literally hundreds of jobs coming out of these. The last thing that we're going to talk about is sort of this, like, what's next. So the focus of the past 2.5 years or so has been kind of on this industry non-specific tech play. So you'll notice if you look at the names of those companies that are associated with Cultivator, it's everything from healthcare to cars to medical things, scheduling software, parking cars, and we're launching into this month actually the first ever AgTech Accelerator. So we're going to have a program at Cultivator specifically that will be targeting ag tech companies. And this is the first time as well where the focus won't just be on Saskatchewan, but it'll be Canada-wide. And this is connected to our recently announced $60 million AgTech Venture Capital Fund called Emertech. So the play between Emertech and Cultivator, while they are separate bodies, Cultivator can support the venture capital fund by bringing awareness to these companies that are out there. And the venture capital can bring real excitement and attention to Cultivator as a place where companies can come and be seen, learn, and have this access to capital that's so important. And so we will be embarking on a 3-year commitment to this AgTech Accelerator starting just over the next few weeks. And that takes us basically to the end of the presentation. So I think we're going to open it up to some questions.
Yeah,
and I know just briefly, Marc-Andre, there was a question from Ross about kind of private funding versus public funding.
Right.
And I responded to it, but just quickly, so up until this point, Cultivator completely funded by Conexus, and then the first venture fund was completely funded by cooperatives. So a number of Saskatchewan crayons, Conexus is the manager, but other crayons have invested, and some private enterprise. There has been a commitment from WD, or now called Prairie's Can, into the evolution of the AgTech Accelerator. And then there was a $15 million commitment. You might have seen the press release in the last provincial budget about an investment in an AgTech fund. That was our AgTech fund. So there has been some public support for both the fund and the AgTech play, but the first fund and the first incubator was completely funded by Conexus.
Great, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Mary. Great, so fascinating, and so many questions popping into my head. Just so folks know, our intent here is to have a breakout conversation. So Jen and I might ask one question each, then we're going to break out, and then we're going to come back, and then we can have a bigger plenary conversation. So you just touched on a point that I really want to kind of drill down a bit on, Eric and Mary, around the policy context. Can you talk to us about the importance of, for example, the tax credit as well in kind of kicking this thing off? We're in a policy school, so these things are kind of central to our audience, some of our audience anyway. So what kind of role is that played in, and what could other provinces perhaps do to kind of model Saskatchewan approach? I don't know who should take that, if that's a hard question or an easy question.
It's a great question, Marc-Andre. So a couple thoughts. One is when we did the research and we went like to Europe, to like some of these really interesting places. Ireland is ripe and very active in terms of incubation, Australia, and found lots of similarities. But two things we found. A, the degree of cohesiveness of the ecosystem is a disproportionate factor on the ability to scale up companies. So I think that was interesting. And the second thing we found was, and with great respect to academics, that what we found was that incubators that are run by either government agencies or by academia didn't perform that well in terms of their ability to continuously scale up companies for whatever reason. But what we do have here in Saskatchewan, we're a very cohesive kind of community. So clearly that was an advantage for us. And then I think the right policy supports are in place. So we do have an ecosystem, and you can see it's funded largely by cooperatives and private enterprise, but there has been policy support from the government. If you look at the Government of Saskatchewan Economic Growth Plan, there's very bold commitments about support for next generation companies in the tech ecosystem. The $15 million investment in the AgTech Fund, the STSI tax credit, I would say is amongst the most aggressive in terms of supporting seed and Series A investments into tech and related startup companies. So our view is that is the appropriate role for government, is at those policy places, as opposed to running incubators and doing things that maybe haven't been successful elsewhere in the world.
So this is amazing what you've been able to get done in 3 years. I'm wondering if in this short period of time, you've been able to make any observations, or you can draw some generalizations about what makes for a good startup in this context. Those that I'm familiar with a few of them that you didn't mention. Team Linked we use for all my son's hockey practices and games now, and Lumica Healthcare, all of that. I had no idea that they came out of this program. What makes for a successful company startup? Is there any lessons?
Yeah, definitely. So the number one thing that comes to mind for me is the founder. So always starting with the founder. Then as you get into a little bit more of the idea and the idea behind the business is not being so tied to your solution, but being really committed to what is the problem that you're trying to solve. So, I mean, you could use the parking as a perfect example. So off-street parking, they're not thinking, they're really focused on what is this problem that we're trying to solve, which actually has changed and evolved throughout the pandemic. Probably before the pandemic, it had a lot to do with working people and space like that. But as you go through something like the pandemic and people's behaviors change, the solution actually probably has to evolve. Like that tech piece, you can't be married to your really fun, smart idea around the solution. You've really got to be honed in on what is that problem that you're trying to solve. And it is sometimes easier as a bystander watching that to sort of pick that out in some of the companies that that we're dealing with. Are they really focused on solving the right problem?
That seems like a good life lesson in general.
Yes, that's a good point. It is.
Well, it's funny, Mary, as you were talking, I was thinking about students who are doing master's degrees and PhDs and writing their papers, and there's a similar kind of dynamic at play oftentimes.
Yeah.
What is the question you're trying to answer in this case, but being very crisp about that. Look, so we have a plan, and we're trying this out. This is a brown bag, so we're going to do a breakout now. And the idea is Stan's going to share a question in the chat, and it's going to ask people to tell the other people at their breakout group a bit about themselves, some reactions to the talk, and any other ideas they may have around how we could get more of this kind of thing happening elsewhere. So that's our breakout. I think Stan will send you off. We're going to have groups of 5 people. We'll reemerge after about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a closing plenary conversation where people can share some of what they've had, some of what they've discussed in the breakout. So Stan, send us away.
And I think 2 groups are going to have special guests.
Yes. Now, this is a random assortment. There's a chance you could both be in the same group, but hopefully not.
All right, everyone will be off right now.